Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming along to this lunchtime seminar that we've put on through the Centre for Justice Innovation. I'm Yvette Tinsley. I'm one of the co-directors of the Centre. We're thrilled to have our speaker along today. She's someone who I've been trying to get along for a while now, and trying to keep making her work with us as well. So we're getting our tentacles into her gradually. So our speaker today is Corinne Seals. She's an associate professor of applied linguistics here at Te Herengawaka Victoria University of Wellington. She focuses on qualitative approaches to applied sociolinguistics, and I'm sure she's going to translate all of that for us today, and is the primary investigator of the Wellington Translanguaging Project and director of its resource branch, Translanguaging Aotearoa. And her team creates teaching materials and runs workshops, engages with policy and planning to further support language reclamation and maintenance efforts in education and in the home, particularly for Māori and Pasifika communities. And Corinne also practices as a forensic linguist, which is why we've got her along today. So she applies linguistic analysis to investigations involving the law, statutes, crime, legal procedure. She's worked with an amazing array of agencies, the police, individuals. She's worked for both the Crown and Defence. And amongst the things that she does is investigation of questions of authorship, speaker identification, policy and statute wording, intended and conveyed information, language and memory, and the needs of multilingual speakers. And that is amongst other things. So she does many, many more things. So just before we get started, I'd like to both welcome Corinne and also welcome all of you to the room. So just to share our faculty karakia, which some of you will be familiar with, Mori oho, Mori tu, Mori ora, kia tātou, homie, huie, tai kie. And so formally welcome Corinne now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yvette, and thank you also to everyone who has given up some lunchtime to come along. I really appreciate you being here. Kia ora koutou. Thank you again for having me here. Ko Corinne Seals aho. And as Yvette mentioned, I'm Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics, as well as Associate Dean of Research for the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. So I like to get my hands in a lot of different kinds of research. Forensic linguistics is one that I have been doing since I was trained in it back in DC, 14 years ago now. So for the last 11 years, I've been doing forensic linguistics in New Zealand, but I also have worked with some overseas agencies, which I'll share a little bit about. But I recognize while some people are very familiar with forensic linguistics, other people may not be so familiar. So let's see, let me get in here. So let's go ahead and just give a brief background to catch everyone up on this. So forensic linguistics covers 4 different primary areas, and I'm going to silence this lectern because I can hear that and the lapel at the same time. There we go. So we've got language and crime is part of forensic linguistics, as well as looking at the intersections between language and police procedure. This includes questioning, when an interpreter is needed, lots of different questions around police procedure and language and the law, interpreting the law, clarity of the law, objections to the law, and language rights, which spans across these areas but goes into policy as well. Forensic linguistics is the scientific approach to the study of language, specifically in the context of investigations, criminal procedure, and legal procedure. Now, when it comes to forensic linguistics, often people think it's, they think maybe phonetics and phonology, or maybe they think it's around interpreting things like plain language law. It is those things, but it's a lot more than that also. It also includes what was said, what is written, who said or wrote it, how it was said or written, and it's that scientific investigation into how it was done that sets it apart as its own field. So just briefly about me, a bit more background. So I got involved in this because I was fortunate enough to do my Master's of Science and PhD in Linguistics at Georgetown University, following on from doing a BA in Laws in the University of California system. And while I was at Georgetown University, my supervisor, Professor Natalie Schilling, is one of the top forensic linguists in the US. And she said, hey, you have a background in law and linguistics. Would you be interested in training in this? And I said, oh, yes. So then I started training in that with her. My Master's of Science was on forensic linguistics, and I continued working in that and training with agents at the FBI Bureau of Behavior Analysis Unit. FBI Behavior Analysis Unit, Forensic Linguistics Unit. And so I trained with them on a number of different forensic linguistics aspects in practice, which then transferred to working on cases, but also teaching forensic linguistics, which I did at Georgetown. I've done a number of seminars across New Zealand and the US in this. And we used to have this course at Vic, and it was really popular. Feel free to let me know if you'd like the course to continue, because we've been playing with the idea of bringing it back. And I've been working on New Zealand cases since 2014. So I thought I'd give you an idea of some of the things I've recently worked on before launching into a closer look at some of them, just to give you an idea of the wide array of things. I'm often asked to look at English language proficiency assessment. So was an interpreter needed during questioning? These cases that go to appeals where someone says, I should have been given an interpreter and I wasn't. So I do an assessment to see if an interpreter was needed. And I will show you as we go an example of exactly what that looks like, right? And then cultural differences during police interviews. For example, when police think someone from a different background is agreeing, are they actually agreeing, right? And what about silence? What does silence mean in different cultural environments? And how does that impact on the interactions that occur? Speaker identification on phone calls, speaker identification of someone in the background of a phone call. That relies a lot on phonetics and phonology, and I'll show you an example of that as one of the first examples we look at. Ambiguity in the law. Here's where plain language comes in policy, but also in general, when the law is interpreted or understood in different ways, how does that ambiguity fall? What's the impact of it? How can we make it clearer? Identifying predictive linguistic indicators of violent events. So most recently, I worked with a UK security agency, which will remain unnamed, on developing a predictive model for when attacks would occur in Ukraine, right? So my background is also Ukrainian. So I made use of those linguistic resources as well as my forensic linguistics training to contribute to developing a predictive model that found catalysts or catalyst indicators for when something would happen based on linguistics that we were able to develop into a model that had about 87% accuracy in predicting when an event would happen so that they could move people out of that space and time. That's probably the one I'm most proud of, to be honest with you, saving lives for real. Authorship attribution. This is something I do often. So looking at written notes, keep in mind this is not handwriting analysis. In forensic linguistics, we don't do handwriting analysis. All right, what we do is we look at more details of the syntax, of the language used, in how it's used. And I'll give some examples also of that, what that analysis looks like as we go. Also from text messages. So I had a case like this recently, looking at what point were the messages no longer actually from the person who owned the phone, but had swapped to being from someone else, right? And that was to help identify a particular date and time when someone else took control of that item. Ear witnesses and testimony. This is also one of my favorite areas. So memory of what was said. When we ask people to testify, what was said? Who did it? Who do you think did this? How accurate are people at doing that? And when they say a suspect sounded like a certain way, how accurate are they at that? And what sort of complicating factors are involved? And I'll give some examples of that one as well. And then finally, clarity of meaning and official communication. So this one I've done a number of cases in, and I had a really large case on this, a national case here a few years ago, looking at some pretty serious miscommunication that led to a pretty serious event, and trying to determine where precisely did the miscommunication occur that led to that event, and what does that tell us about how things were being communicated, and how can we make it better fit for purpose? All right. So let me get into some examples. The first one that I will present to you is, as I mentioned, phonetics and phonology is an area that a lot of people think of when they think of forensic linguistics. So in this particular case, I was asked to help identify someone on a phone call, right? And I get a few of these a few times every so often. And in this particular case, we were looking at, I looked at how the speaker pronounced certain sounds, right? We couldn't look at every aspect of how the speaker pronounced things because of the fact it was a phone call, and that restricts the frequency in which we can operate, because phone calls don't pick up the highest frequencies, right? So within that restricted area, I looked at specific indicators of how sounds were pronounced. Now, this is an example of kind of what a spread looks like in New Zealand, a typical spread for how men produce certain sounds. I'm going to focus in this example I'm giving you now on this sound. We call it the foot or hood vowel, is that sound, right? So when we look in a vowel space such as this, we're looking at the hertz or frequency in hertz of how certain sounds are produced. And we have software in linguistics, right, that lets us measure this. And so in this is where we would expect the typical vowel space to sit on this particular sound. This is what a screenshot of our software looks like, right? So this is Prot. My linguists in the room will know Prot. And here we've got, I was looking at, in this particular example I'm sharing with you, I was looking at instances of how that particular vowel was pronounced in disputed recordings. Now, keep in mind that this is one of many things looked at, right? So just one of these features is not enough to determine anything. It's one of many, right? So in this example that I'm showing you, I was looking at the formants of the questioned foot vowel in the disputed recording. And you can see the frequencies I've written out here, the frequencies for the F1, as we call it, and the F2, which align with over here. Now then I asked for recordings where we knew who the people were, right? So I could look at how those were pronounced in known Wellington phonetics software. Right, so it's likely a different speaker, or at least there's not enough confidence to show that it would likely be the same speaker, and that's important. There's the element of doubt in that. So that's an example of phonetics and phonology. Now I'll show you an example of authorship attribution. So for this particular case, it was a potential abuse case, right? And without giving too much information, the police were given a handwritten letter from a child's caregiver. And the child's caregiver said, my child has written this letter. And it was a retraction letter for something the child had said before, right? And this child's in primary school. And I was asked by police, what is the likelihood that the child actually wrote this letter? Because this is the crux of whether we can proceed or not, right? In the investigation we're doing. And so I asked for known pieces of writing from the child, which we call KDocs. and then there was the letter in question, which is a Q doc. To begin the case, and this is where I'm going to give you guys a bit of background in how this works. To begin the case, we would look at a K doc and Q doc comparison. And to look at that comparison, we would look at several different things. We could look at sociolinguistic variation, which is how we alter our speech in different social environments and according to different social aspects of ourselves and other people. We could look at lexical items, so the word choices. We could look at discourse analysis, how language is acting in a particular discursive environment. We could look at variation in spelling. We could look at syntactic complexity, such as, how complex are these sentences? As we get older and as we get exposed to more formal education, our syntax gets more complex, right? So this is a number of different options I had for looking at this case. And again, we don't use handwriting, right? That's not linguistic, that's stylistics. And stylistics is usually not part of forensic linguistics. An example of how you would look at Q docs and K docs. This is an example that comes from McMenamin, sorry. Sorry to him. And here you've got, as an example, the question doc. So the Q doc, you don't know for sure who wrote it or it's under question. The known document where you know for sure who wrote it. You would look at different instances of a variable. So for instance, if you have can't somewhere, can't could linguistically occur as cannot as one word or cannot as two words. We're not interested in what is grammatically or educationally correct, right? We're interested in what people actually do. So these are the different possibilities for this variable. And so in this particular example that McMenamin shows, you would have here 22 instances in the question doc of cannot, 21 of cannot written that way, 35 of can't. You look at the percentages and then compare those to the known. So in this case, these percentages are pretty close, which shows you that there's indicators that they are alike. And you would want a lot of different variables to look at like that to see what the indicators tell you across, right? So that's one short example of how you do Q docs and K docs. And there are different things you can look at. This is just a short example of some of them. But we might look, for instance, at some things like the article. So a or the, is the article present or absent? Is the subject present or absent? So these are all examples where it's present. These are examples where it's absent. The object, right? So is the object present or absent? Absent. The plural, is the plural present or absent? Same with T, not versus no. Now, to us in this room, in a more academic space, we might think, but how often do people actually have these absent? A lot. All right. Often. Yeah. So it's much more frequent than you think. And all of these together, plus many others, whatever else is occurring in the text of interest becomes a feature to examine. And you examine every instance or potential instance of that. All right, so, and then discourse analysis, I mentioned not only do we look at sociolinguistic variation like this, but we look at discourse analysis as well. So what is the form that the language took, which shows us things like this, but also sentence structures, words used, all of that, but also what was the function of the words being used? What was said, how was it said? And what was implied by the word choice? We have options, we can say anything. Right? So in that context where we can choose to say anything, any multitude of ways, what was the function of saying a particular thing? What was the goal in choosing to say it that way? And then was it successful in the communicative event or not? Was it understood? Was it not understood? Was there miscommunication? What led to that miscommunication? We look in the actual spread of discourse for clues to all of that. And then within sociolinguistic variation, we also can look at style, because as I've written here, we have options in language, so our choices matter. And those choices that we make so speech acts, indirectly or directly asking someone to do something, right? As well as characteristics of your own speech. So you can have idiosyncratic features of your speech where you tend to use certain words or phrases or to express things in certain ways. Those become part of your style of how you speak, right? And those can be, when they co-occur in a certain way together, they can help us with authorship attribution features as well. And we look at where did these things occur, how, and where could it occur, but it didn't. And that last question is really important for when we look at cases of deception, right? Where someone's trying to pretend to be someone else, right? So then we can look at things like, well, according to the pattern of how this person always uses these stylistic features, I would have expected it to also be here, here, and here, and it's not, right? So that can give us additional clues. And when we look at deception, we have other things we can look at as well when someone's pretending to be someone else. So we could look at things like quotation. These are aspects of deception generally in discourse, where if someone is using more direct quotation, then they're often putting responsibility for what was said directly on someone else and distancing themselves from what was said. Whereas there's an aspect of co-ownership of responsibility when you use indirect quotation. Passive language is also a distancing tactic, to use more passive instead of active language. And a number of forensic linguistics investigations academically have shown a greater use of third-person pronoun when speaking about things. So then she went outside. Yeah, but who saw her? I saw her, right? I didn't say I saw her go outside. I said then she went outside. So I'm distancing myself from responsibility of claiming what happened there. And then when first person is used, me and my are used more often in distancing discourse and in deception than I is. And remember, these are always more often, not exclusive yes or no, right? They're trends. Also, we find that within deceptive discourse, there's often more purposeful ambiguity. So using words with multiple possible meanings, such as, did you tell her that I sent the file today? And saying she didn't get it. Again, avoiding any of the I, avoiding any direct answers to the question being asked, and implying meaning, and also implying the non-stated actor. So everything possible has been done. By whom? So again, avoiding the stating the actor, and also directly irrelevant reply. And this comes to what we call Grice's maxims, where Grice has, this scholar, linguist Grice, had a number of maxims we follow for direct and clear communication. And one of the maxims is the maxim of relevance. And when people are being ambiguous on purpose, they will flout that maxim of relevance and give directly irrelevant information, such as, where are you keeping all the files? I've already told you all I can. Now, directly linguistically speaking, that has not answered the question. That is irrelevant to that immediate question, but it's being used as a way to deflect focus. So back to this particular case, when I was looking at it and trying to determine, okay, did this child write it or did someone else write it pretending to be the child? I was looking at two particular areas. One was lexical variation between and across the text, and another was syntactic complexity. Now, when you choose areas to focus on, it is an experimental process, right? So you're using your tools. They're not always helpful, but you're using what you have to try to get to answers. So lexical variation gave no result, right? Which was pretty disappointing. But what you can see here is the Q doc here, the question doc, and then the K docs. There were almost none of the same features being used across, right? So that meant it was almost impossible to compare. That was unexpected. That rarely happens. Right? But in this case, that happened. And you can't make a claim about absence of evidence, right? So that meant that was no result. However, When analyzing the syntax, now we got a result. All right, so syntactic complexity analyzer is a tool that can look at a number of different aspects of how we're putting our sentences together. Here, I'm going to focus on 4 in particular. MLS is the mean length of the sentence. So it's the average length of a sentence. MLT is the mean length of a T unit. A T unit is a core grammatical clause within a sentence and anything that is dependent syntactically upon it. This is really where you can see the science coming in, right? The linguistic science. And then VPT is a verb phrase per T unit. So again, that T unit, a core grammatical clause and anything dependent on it. That's looking at the verb and everything dependent upon that verb. So the verb phrase within that T unit, right? And then CNT is a complex nominal per T unit. So how many noun phrases can be found within that T unit? All right, so these are different linguistic measures. So I ran through the QDoc and the KDocs in that and looked at these aspects. Now, anyone who doesn't absolutely love tables, I've made you a graph. All right, so what do we see? Well, we see here the last bar each time is the QDoc. And these other 3 are the KDocs. So the KDocs are the ones we know were written by the child. The QDoc is the one under question. It was in the child's handwriting. This is why we don't use handwriting, right? Because the child wrote it, hand wrote it. But the question was, did the child author it? Right? And here we can see there were much higher numbers for the MLS, MLT, VPT, and CNT, which are the sentences within that, the syntactic structure, which tells us, what's that tell us? That someone with access to much higher syntactic complexity wrote the QDocs than the syntactic complexity within the KDocs. And the MLS and MLT values for the KDocs corresponded directly to the syntactic sophistication we would expect for someone in primary school, which the child was. But the values for the QDoc corresponded directly to syntactic sophistication normally found in secondary school or above. Right, so what did that tell us? It was a very strong indicator that while the child handwrote it, the child was told what to write, right? Which meant that the child was not individually responsible for the authorship of that document. So the police proceeded with their investigation. Okay, that's one example. Now I'm going to give you an example of second language speakers of English and analyzing the language within that. This is something I get asked to do often. So here, in this particular example, I'll give you the accused is an additional language speaker of English. So we use that. We don't say like English as a second language, English as another language. Now the correct term is additional language speaker. All right, so additional language speaker of English who had lived in New Zealand for 5 years, and this person's first language was Arabic. The forensic linguistic evidence here, how I was involved, was looking at police interviews that were conducted solely in English. The officer within that determined that an interpreter was not needed, and it had now gone to appeal. And I was asked, can you look at this and let us know, was an interpreter actually needed? Should there have been one? Because that was the basis of the appeal. Right, I told you the last point there. So when we look at measures of language proficiency and determining that in cases like this, we ask a couple different questions. And one of those questions is, are the speakers of the second or additional language able to accurately comprehend implied meaning and discourse when the conversation is in their second language? Now, it's important to consider implied meaning because a lot of what we say is implied in our discourse. We don't give direct, simple statements and questions every single time we speak. So it's very important, especially in a case such as when you're asking someone to recount what they've done. You would be surprised, or maybe not surprised, some people are surprised, at how much implicature takes place in these encounters. There's a lot, all right? So are speakers of these additional languages able to accurately comprehend that implied meaning? We know that it actually takes a whole lot of linguistic strategies in a language to interpret implied meaning. And it's especially difficult to understand that implied meaning if the information is making more frequent use of indirect measures or indirect expression of opinion. And that implied meaning in sentences is even more difficult for people to understand if the language speakers have lower proficiency in the language in which it's being done. I mean, these kind of follow on from each other, right? And what's important here, actually, I want to jump to this one. This is an example of why it's important to look at how people process implied meaning. A test sentence that's often used, or the type of test sentence often used to determine if someone can understand what's being said, is a basic interpersonal communication skills sentence, such as, when did you learn English? Syntactically, when we break it down, we see it looks like that. You've got you as the center, did learn, when English, so we've got 3 levels of embedding, right? An actual real courtroom sentence, which is closer to help, what we call cognitive academic language proficiency, to understand what's actually said in courts. It's more like, this is a real sentence from a court, right? And is that because of what you have told? Is that he threatened to not just bash you, but bash, I work your words, all of you, right? This is an actual sentence. And it looks like this. All right, that's what you're processing. All right, look at how many levels of embedding there are. Right? And these are the same sentences we see during police interviews. These are the same sentences we see in courtrooms, because it's how we talk, right? So we don't have everything scripted out to simple basic sentences like this. So you can see the problem and the disconnect when the sentences using to test and the questions using to test if someone understands look like this, but the actual discourse when you get going looks like this, right? So, and often people will say, well, but they answered very quickly. But we have forensic evidence abounding that shows us that quick response time in a language is not equivalent to accuracy and comprehension. So if someone answers quickly, that has no direct correlation to how well they understood. All right. Speed is not related to comprehension of accuracy for additional speakers of English either. And any sort of figurative meaning, so that's anything implied, any idioms, any asking you to reflect on hypotheticals, any of that is much more difficult for language speakers to access. And even advanced language users have difficulty with that. Okay, so what's this all mean for our analysis? It means that the 2,000 most frequent words are often what's tested for. What that means is when we use these test sentences, where it's based on asking people, do you have access to the 2,000 most frequently spoken words in English, right? To have a basic conversation. But to understand the figurative language and the complexity in how it's used in police interviews and courtrooms, you actually have to have access to the 8,000 most frequently spoken words in English. So there's a disconnect between common practice and actual need. So keeping that in mind, when I go to do analyses like this, I look at vocabulary profiles, and I use something called the BNC COCA 25K list, which is an international word list of the most frequently spoken words used in the English language, which means the higher the frequency of the words, the more likely low proficiency speakers can comprehend them, right? So the top 1,000 most frequent words of English means those are the first words people usually learn, right? When we get to 8,000, we're talking advanced. Right, more advanced. So mastery up to 2,000 words in a language, people will usually test at basic level proficiency. And that has previously been thought to be enough to understand what's happening in procedures, right? Mastery of 8,000 words is considered mid-level. And we know now that's what's actually needed to understand what's going on. And most speakers need to have a minimum 6,000 words in their working vocabulary to understand 90% of what's said in a conversation. That still leaves out 10%, but now you've got at least 90, right? So here's an example of one I did where I found that no interpreter was needed. And this was a case where the person said, I needed an interpreter and I didn't get one. And he said, I didn't mean what I said. I didn't understand the questions being asked. And so I did an analysis and I looked at the detective's vocabulary during the interview and ran a vocab profile on her as well as syntactic complexity. And then I did the same for the suspect. And I found it was very likely that at least 95% of the detective's language and possibly up to 98% was understood by the suspect during the police interview. So in this case, this was someone who was trying to say the conviction should be overturned because in this particular case, he was actually regretting what he had said, right? So I can see that too, right? Which is helpful. But sometimes we also need to look at, sometimes it comes out that the person did actually need an interpreter. So in this case, the first one I mentioned with the speaker who had been here for 5 years, was first language speaker of Arabic, I found that almost 90% of his vocab is within the first 1,000 most frequent words spoken in English. He has an additional 0.5% of vocab in the 2,000 most frequent words. Less than 3% of his vocabulary is in the mid-level range of fluency, and none of his vocabulary was in the advanced. And here it's just a note that there are red lexical items in a different, that sometimes appear in this chart that are non-English words or proper nouns. So we don't consider that in the vocabulary inventory. But so what that showed me was that he likely didn't understand all that was going on. And this was also further confirmed by him asking for definitions for words like describe, strike, and hop into a car, which the first two are within the most frequent 2,000 words, and the third is a common idiom in English. So those were further indicators he didn't understand the basics of what was being said. Now, if I go back, we also look, as I mentioned, at discourse. So looking at implied meaning in a sentence. And as I mentioned, that's really particularly difficult for people when they're in a setting that's not their normal sociocultural setting. Because what's salient for us as first language speakers of a language is not always salient for people who grew up in other contexts. And stressful situations have a really huge impact on people being able to understand in those particular situations. So when I did the discourse analysis of it as well, because this is a case where the officer said, nah, he didn't need an interpreter, he understood. And when I look at the discourse analysis, the officer asked, what does the right to remain silent mean? And he said, I don't know. And later when asked again, the suspect said, if I'm right, I'm silent, then I'm right, and so that second part of the statement to me as a forensic linguist indicates that he thought the words, he understood the words silent and right, but he hasn't comprehended the direct meaning of the legal rights because he thought right meant correct, right? Not a right that you have, but right as correct. And when asked about the right to remain silent and how he understood that, he said, I just mean why when you talking, or it mean I should listen to be quiet, yeah? Showing that he's interpreted it to mean that when the officer's talking, he should be silent and listen, which is a cultural turn-taking practice for politeness. It's not directly related to understanding your rights in the legal context. And the suspect throughout that interview continuously referenced cultural norms and what he thought was quote unquote right or not according to cultural norms, while the officer continuously referenced the law, right? So they were talking at cross purposes. And in an example of that, the officer asked if the suspect knew about differences in the law, and the suspect talked about parent responsibility. So he was still talking about cultural norms, not laws, right? So it was difficult to then establish if he knew his rights under the law because he wasn't even operating within that frame, right? Just more examples of that where the officer quoted some statements from the plaintiffs and said that each statement is probably not true, or they've told you maybe lies, which is leading, first of all. But second of all, then it was unclear if that inference in what the officer was saying was understood by the suspect because he never addressed it, right? There was no uptake to it. He continued telling his story. There was no uptake at all for those inferences. And then those instances of not directly addressing, the officer used those instances to say that the suspect agreed with him because he didn't contradict him, right? Which is quite the jump to make. Because culturally, to disagree with an officer when you've grown up in a context where that's not allowed, right? There's some issues there. And throughout, the suspect would often say yes or yeah. So if the officer said, that's right, isn't it? He'd say yes or yeah. That was taken to be acceptance and agreement. But we know that that can also be what we call gratuitous concurrence, where you say yes in answer to a question or no if it's phrased negatively, regardless of if you actually agree or not, or if you even understand, because you're being prompted to give that answer. And so you're trying to show alignment and politeness. Right, so the total there, then the outcome of that, this was a very complicated case. This was a very frustrating case because at the end, the outcome was the judge's report said that the forensic linguistics evidence was very convincing, but he was not going to allow the appeal anyway. Right, so sometimes that happens. That's frustrating. I can only do what I can do as a forensic linguist and stay in my lane, right? But still, we work to the data that's there and present the report on what's there. Okay, and then the last one I wanted to show you, I thought we'd do a little bit of something fun and test how good is your memory. Really? All right, so I'm going to ask you a few questions I want you to think about. What's the most interesting thing that you heard today before this talk? And I want you to think about what's the name of the person who said it? Where do they work? What did they say before that interesting thing? And what did they say after that interesting thing? And at what time did they say it? Give you a second. All right, so some people do pretty good on this one, right? Some people say, yep, I got it. And other people are saying, I'm already lost. So we get a wide array in here. But keep in mind, this is something that I've asked you about that happened today, within the last few hours, right? And so this is similar to if an event happens and someone gives testimony nearly right after it happens, right? Now, what is also very common for people to do when they're giving testimony on an event is at your last work meeting, whenever that may have been, what was the first item on the agenda? Now we're going back in time, right? It may have been yesterday, may have been this morning, may have been last week. It may have been before that. What was the first item on the agenda? What was the first topic brought up that was not on the agenda? So who brought something up that was not on the agenda? What was it? Who brought it up? Who responded? And what happened next in the sequence of events? Now, sometimes we get people who say, yep, I got it. I absolutely got it. I know what the answer is. Okay, now let me put to you, just because you're convinced doesn't mean it's right. right? And let me show you some evidence for that. As time passes, accuracy of memory drastically drops, first of all. But regardless of time passing or not, your prior knowledge about people and things, your prior experiences, and your expectations around people and events greatly affect your memory. And that includes your expectations of who best fits the characteristics or the character of the event. Other things that impact upon your memory include whether or not it's typical voice quality. So that's tone, pitch, if your voice is creaky or not, all of those aspects. When voice quality is not typical, then it's also harder for people to identify and remember correctly who said what. If someone's voice quality is very similar to someone else, it's more difficult to identify who said it. If pitch, stress, and intonation are different than normal, as they usually are in stressful situations, then it's also difficult to accurately pinpoint someone. If you have been frequently exposed to a particular speaker, you're more likely to identify them, whether or not the speaker was actually them, the speaker in question, than compared to if you're less frequently exposed to someone. If you have prior knowledge of the person or topic, that will influence what you remember and what you think happened. And the length of time the speaker holds the floor, or how long they're talking for uninterrupted, also matters. So they need to be holding the floor for 60 seconds or more of continuous speech to be able to identify the speaker above the level of chance. Now, in quick moments, when events happen that you're asked to testify about later or give a statement on later, how often is that person speaking for 60 seconds uninterrupted? Right? Not often. So that's another challenge. Now, let me show you this example this was a study from Loftus and Palmer. Some people may know, a very famous psychology-based forensic study in the 70s, but still very relevant today. Now, in this case, people were shown a video of a car crash, right? And they were asked to reflect on it the next day and then reflect on it a week later when Loftus and Palmer called them to ask them about it. Now, Loftus and Palmer purposefully used different verbs to describe the events to prompt what people had seen. They asked what happened when the cars smashed, what happened when the cars collided, when they bumped, when they hit, when they contracted. Different groups were asked with different verbs. The group that was asked with the verb smashed, 32% of them talked about the broken glass on the road. And a week later, they said, oh, that was really shocking, the broken glass. 14% of the people who had the word hit talked about that. There was never broken glass on the road. All right. So even the word choice used in prompting people to recall events can affect what's remembered. Now, I also did a study on this. I did a follow-up replication on Loftus and Palmer. This was about 15 years ago. And let's talk about this later. So in this study, I had two groups of people, 5 people in each group. And I asked them to talk for 30 minutes, open discussion. They agreed to 2 topics everyone had. And so the 2 groups both discussed the same 2 topics, right? Now, I took notes on what they were saying, and I asked them about different things that were brought up and talked about the immediately after, and then the day after, and then the week after, right, to report on their memory. I also had different types of unexpected events happening for each group that would pop up, like someone walking by singing while they were talking and things like that, right? So what happened? Well, we can see here, this is the day after, and this is a week after. How accurate were they in what they remembered? Oh my, right? The majority of people sit around 50, 60%, right? In terms of accuracy of what was remembered. And then for most people, that dropped further a week later. However, what was very accurate was people, I don't have a diagram for this here, but people almost always got a very high accuracy score for reporting a week later what they had said the day later, right? So once they said it here, they were more likely to say it again and believe it when they said it again, right? To the point that I had people who believed someone else said something that they themselves had said, and they were so sure of that, that when I played them the recording back, they needed to take a moment. Right? So we very much become convinced of what we've already reported, what we've already constructed in our memory as time goes on. So people most accurately remember what they said happened, not what actually happened, but they most accurately remember what they said happened. And they're more likely to attribute statements to someone who they thought would normally say that, right? So if something was very assertive, for instance, it was attributed to the men in the group, regardless of if the women said it or not. Right? If something was said that was very political, then the people who are known for being more political had it attributed to them, whether they said it or not. They were more likely to forget someone's contribution if it didn't fit in with their prior knowledge and view of that person. They were also more likely to remember overall when someone drew on facts than when someone drew on personal experience. So when people were sharing information about personal experience, that often got forgot. But when someone was talking about facts or statements made by particular people or reporting any of those, like reporting things in the news and all of that, that was more likely to be remembered. And incorrect speaker attribution was very high for when people were talking about their experiences. And then those distractions that I put in there, such as people randomly walking by singing and whatnot, significantly dropped accuracy of memory during those moments in time. So who and what gets remembered? We're more likely to attribute statements to someone we expected to say a particular thing, such as those who regularly contribute or are in a position of power. We're also more likely to remember speakers who are drawing on reported facts and figures, which typically is pakeha due to socialization, right? That's not because pakeha men naturally do that. That's because of the ways in which we're socialized to speak in society. And distraction by more pressing factors also significantly dropped accuracy of memory, which can include things like closely scheduled meetings, pressing deadlines, any sort of event that is unexpected and out of the ordinary, which are also the types of events we're often asked to give testimony about, right? So this is particularly significant for witness testimony when we're thinking about what we're asking people to testify about and when. And it's important to keep in mind that someone can be completely sincere in what they're saying, completely believing it's the truth. It doesn't mean it's accurate, right? And there are other complicating factors that are involved in this. So when someone is rehearsing what they're going to say or practicing, then they are actually remembering the narrative of what they've practiced to say before the official statement, right? And the more you rehearse and refine that testimony, the more that becomes your truth. Okay. So then the idea of is someone telling the truth or not becomes a lot more difficult to process because for them they are. Okay. All right. And just an additional point to throw in there, this was related to another case I had where I was asked how likely it was that the witnesses, what they reported was true or was accurate, not true, was accurate. And it came out that before the officers got there to take the testimony, the witnesses had been talking to each other, saying, you're right, you're right. Oh yeah, you're right, you're right. So they were absolutely convinced of what they said, but that just absolutely made it completely unreliable. Right. So because and that was one of the questions, because the judge said, well, but they were convinced. And they were sure that what they were saying was true. And I said, that's great. But what they're remembering is what they talked about. Okay. So in summary, I showed you guys a lot of different examples. I just wanted to summarize here that there are many different things that forensic linguistics can look at. We apply our toolkit of understanding of linguistics and the law in all different types. I've shown you a number of examples. There are many more that go beyond this as well. But in sum, I think it's really important for us to always be mindful of the other experts who are around us, who we can draw upon and work together to make stronger cases and stronger projects, whether it be research projects or actual practice. It's really important to be mindful of each other so that we can draw together and fill those gaps in our knowledge to build stronger teams. All right, thank you. I think I gave 1 minute left.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Corinne. You have taken us on this journey showing us the potential of forensic linguistics for justice innovation, for law reform, and in supporting meaningful access to justice as well. So thanks to you, thanks to the Boring Foundation for funding of the centre and therefore of this event. Thanks to the Faculty of Law for housing us, and particularly to Anna and Alex, who have been doing a lot, but particularly Anna organising this event for us. And another reminder about the student posters that are out there in the foyer for a little bit longer. They're fantastic. So we just close again with our karakia. Mori oho, mori tu, mori ora kia tato, homie, huie, tai kie. Thanks.